So I was replaying Star Wars The Force Unleashed, and I wanted to talk about the opening level or the prologue to the game because it got me thinking about something that I really haven't considered before. The opening level to Star Wars The Force Unleashed is about as close as we're going to get when it comes to a Darth Vader video game. The game has been out for nearly 20 years since its first release, and to this day it is still talked about as one of the greatest Star Wars games ever created. The level kicks off with a battle raging on Kashyyyk. Vader enters the fray after coming off of his ship, and an Imperial officer greets him while dodging blaster fire. Now, while the Imperial officer starts mouthing off about how he's trying to push back the Wookiees, they're offering greater resistance than expected, and they're going to get them eventually, Vader begins to force choke him because he's not really concerned with that problem. He's there for something entirely different: a Jedi. And so the game hands the reins over to the player with only instructions on how to play the game. We as the player find out that nothing and no one is off limits when it comes to the powers of the dark side and Darth Vader. As Vader will instruct Starkiller later on, we attack all that are in our way, be it Imperial, Wookiee, or Rebel. The destructive environment also adds a level of depth that feeds into the player's power fantasy. So, with all that being said, let's look at how Force Unleashed treated. With all that being said, let's take a look at how The Force Unleashed treated Darth Vader as far as his gameplay. Now, this opening level captures what I think would be essentially Vader's movement in a video game, as well as Star Wars Battlefront 2. In Star Wars Battlefront 2, both the 2005 version and 2017 version, Vader is still sluggish compared to his heroes and villain counterparts, but they are trying to make up for it, they being the developers. In the 2005 version, they give him what I call a force sprint, and in the 2017 version, he can physically run. In the Star Wars Force Unleashed, however, he doesn't run at all. In fact, he just walks with purpose. One could make the argument that the pace at which Vader moves in is in contrast to how deliberate he is with his movements. They are purposeful, and I always think of Michael Myers or Jason, where their victims run and they walk, sort of adding another layer of fear to it. However, we all know that the reason for this slow pace walking is because of the fact that he is more machine now than man, twisted and evil. When he moved prior to the suit, he wasn't burdened with its machine parts. In the Legends book Star Wars Rise of Darth Vader by James Luceno, we learn about how Vader had to adjust to his new body. Now, while this story is no longer canon, it does a great job highlighting certain details that may be overlooked. For example, how Vader went from moving like Anakin Skywalker with confidence and gravitas, and Skywalker could afford to be flashy with his movements because he had the speed to do so, whereas Vader not so much. An excerpt from the book. His alloy lower legs were bulked by strips of armor similar to those that filled and gave form to the long glove Anakin had worn over his right prosthesis. What remained of his real limbs ended in bulbs of grafted flesh, inserted into machines that triggered movement through the use of modules that interfaced with his damaged nerve endings. But instead of being Durasteel, the medical droids had substituted an inferior alloy and had failed to inspect the strips that protected the electromotive lines. As a result, the inner lining of the pressurized bodysuit was continually snagging on places where the strips were anchored to knee and ankle joints. The tall boots were a poor fit for his artificial feet, whose claw-like toes lacked the electrostatic sensitivity of his equally false fingertips. Raised in the heel, the cumbersome footgear canted him slightly forward, forcing him to move with an exaggerated caution lest he stumble or topple over. Worse, they were so heavy that he often felt rooted to the ground, or as if he were moving in high gravity. What good was motion of this sort if he was going to call on the Force even to walk from place to place? He may as well have resigned himself to using a repulsor chair and abandoned any hope of movement. Now, it is common knowledge that Palpatine basically nerfed, for lack of a better term, Darth Vader in order to prevent any sort of idea of turning against him. In the canon comics, Palpatine violently shocks Vader after Vader ended up force pushing him out of anger after hearing about Padme's death. Speaking of this comic book run, I think the Vader game would not be possible from this perspective. Personally, I would want to experience Vader becoming Darth Vader. What I mean by that is, we all know Darth Vader for being this menacing, violent, ruthless Dark Lord of the Sith. I mean, a moment ago I just compared him to Michael Myers. But at the end of episode 3, no one knows who Vader is, and in some ways, neither does Vader. This is where I think the Vader video game could happen from a story perspective. Personally, as a gamer, I would want to experience Vader with no lightsaber and only using the dark side of the Force just momentarily. I want to know how he hunts down different Jedi and more or less level him up as his reputation spreads across the Empire as someone to not be messed with. For those who don't know, what I just described is basically the first few issues of the Darth Vader comic book that takes place immediately after episode 3. Now, it is not lost on me that I'm also kind of describing The Force Unleashed, but I am sure that there could be another way to spin it. Create another what-if scenario like we did with Force Unleashed, or if you want to be kind of lazy about it, use the storylines from the comic books and give us the gameplay throughout it. You could even have Matt Sloan to voice Darth Vader, whom, by the way, I think should voice Vader in all future projects. His performance as Vader in The Force Unleashed, along with the other LEGO projects, was amazing and captures Vader in a unique way in regards to his performance in the Force Unleashed video games. And this would be amazing, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's been talked about at LucasArts. But I can also see why it may never happen. First off, I want to go back to the idea of Vader's movement. Vader moves too slow in a world where everything around him is moving at such a fast pace. As I stated earlier, the reason why I think they had to give Vader a sprint in the other Battlefront games was because everyone around him more or less moves like a bullet in regards to his heroes and villain counterparts. Now, they could follow the Warhammer idea and just have him be a sluggish man and work around it, but that would be up to the developer as to how they want to proceed. I'm not saying it's not possible, but there are going to be roadblocks. Maybe. I'm not a developer, I don't know. Secondly, there is the story in the comics that is already being told, if not already told. Disney, more specifically Lucasfilm, doesn't like to have stories in between their major projects to be impacting the major plot lines. For the Force's sake, as amazing as Rogue One was, the running joke is that the story was basically justifying why there's a 2-meter wide hole in a giant space station. Finally, the story being told now. I referenced earlier that Marvel has been exploring what Darth Vader has been doing in between the original trilogies. How he bled his crystal and created his own lightsaber, how we found out who the pilot was that blew up the Death Star, and other stories in between that I recommend to anyone who is a Darth Vader fan. There was also Vader Immortal. Now, Vader Immortal was a meta experience released in 2019, according to the writer and executive producer David Goyer. He called it a meta experience. And the game, or in this case the experience, would later be released in PlayStation VR in 2020. Now, the story of Vader Immortal takes place a year after Revenge of the Sith, where Vader uses a smuggler, who is us, the quote-unquote player, to open a device. The smuggler is a descendant of a Force-sensitive being tied to the ancient past of Mustafar. The article, First Look Inside Star Wars' Vader Immortal, quote, "You are performing as a captured smuggler. As your starship is drawn to the volcanic world of Mustafar, you learn you have latent force powers that Vader believes can help him solve an ancient mystery that will lead to relics that can help the Sith bridge the chasm between life and death." End quote. Now, I won't go too deep into the story of Vader Immortal. However, I do think that the perspective of it is interesting as far as exploring Vader's life on Mustafar and how he spends his private moments. Even the writer David Goyer explains what does Vader do in these private moments. He explains it in the article, which I'll link in the video in the description of the video. But I want to conclude this video by saying that I'm not saying a Darth Vader game is not possible. I am sure that there's still ideas left to explore for Darth Vader. If Lucasfilm wants to play it safe and completely just go crazy with their story like they did with Force Unleashed, they could give us a what-if scenario, much like they did with the Force Unleashed games. However, I do realize Lucasfilm has their own ideas and has their own storylines and characters that they want to bring to life. And love it or hate it, those are the stories that they feel they should tell. So let me know your thoughts in the comments on what a Vader game would look like. Maybe we can make our own. Which, by the way, I'm kidding. I do not have the mental capacity to do that. I barely had the mental capacity to write this script. Anyway, I'll see you in the next one. Bye!